Our first speaker is Mohamed Sharaf, who's a Sudanese journalist. So great pleasure in introducing him to speak to us first.
I find it really hard to sit down when I speak, so if you allow me to stand up, that'd be great. I think it's worth standing up for the revolution as well. Yes. So how many of you have come here today to get inspired by a revolution? All of you. Why do you want a revolution? Do you want to learn about this revolution to kind of reshape the politics in this country as well? Yeah. Yes. Looking forward to the Sudanese revolution. So, in 2011, one of my friends, he was Tunisian, and you know what was happening in the Arab world then? He asked me, Mohamed, there's lots of trouble happening in Sudan. Why is it that you guys are not doing anything? And to be honest, I didn't have an answer to that at all. I think I do have an answer now. The Sudanese people waited all this time to have a proper revolution. Whether it is proper or not, this is something we'll find out now. But that was my thought when the revolution started in Sudan. For those of you who don't know much about the history of Sudan, I'm just going to quickly give you some kind of background before giving my opinion about what's happening. So Sudan was declared an independent nation in 1956 from Britain, believe it. And then we had democracy, but that didn't last long. A couple of years, that was toppled by General Aboud, and that coup was actually supported by some democratic parties. That's democracy and dictatorship working together to bring in dictatorship. So that lasted until 1964. We had an uprising that brought back democracy. That lasted 5 years. We had another military coup, and this time it was supported by the left, the Sudanese Marxist Party, and that dictatorship of Numeri lasted for about 17 years. 16, 17 years, yeah. That's when I was born, actually. I was born just before that, after that uprising, actually. So I've only seen one revolution, which is this actual one. Thank you for the accuracy. So that, and 1985, we had a transitional government that lasted for 1 year. 1986 elections, 1989, another military coup, and this time supported by the Muslim Brotherhood. But the general who led the coup didn't announce that and pretended that he was a revolutionary, who's here for the people. It turned out a year and a half after that it was supported by the Islamists, basically. But we didn't really do anything, and we had to endure that for 30 years. Al-Bashir has a long criminal record. He killed so many people in Darfur. We think he killed about 300,000 people. We admitted having killed 10,000, but that alone is a lot for a lot of loss for the humanity. He practiced some kind of military neoliberalism by privatizing everything in the country and kind of just attributing it to the generals and members of his own family and tribe. He brought in some terrorists. Who's the most famous terrorist you've ever known? And I should have, absolutely, I could. However, I forgot to be a bit more accurate. Islamist terrorist, Osama bin Laden. So that guy was there in Sudan, was hosted, and he was having all the nice dinners with the Islamists in Sudan, and that brought curse to Sudan, plenty of sanctions, and that worsened the situation. So people couldn't bear that for a long time. In 2013, people took it to the streets, but they cracked down on people and killed 200 people. And that semi-uprising didn't last long. In 2018, people were queuing for everything, for bread, for cash in ATMs, for diesel, for absolutely everything. And this new generation, my generation, happy days, and even younger generation decided to take it to the streets and defy the bullets because they knew that there's nothing to fear but fear itself. So, 5 minutes. I'm talking a lot. This protest lasted 6 months before the climax happened on the 6th of April, when people occupied the square just outside the military headquarters. And that really puts pressure on al-Bashir, who was eventually toppled by his own supporters. But it was a happy day, but it was a disappointing day at the same time, because those who toppled him were the very people that supported him to kill our people in Darfur for the last 30 years. It was a semi-happy moment. So we brought a second government down the second day, and the guy called Abdeljalil decided just to kind of step down. And we were in a situation when we had a third guy called Al-Burhan, but Burhan brought with him someone who's a disruption to the political arena in Sudan, a guy called Hemeti. Hemeti is actually, he was the attack dog for the government in Darfur. He supported the government. He is the very Janjaweed that we talk about. But in a way, he found his way to kind of legalize his forces, and people started to call those forces the rapid support forces. I call them the rapid killing forces. So we have these two guys, and we had to negotiate with them, unfortunately. I'm not going to get into the nitty-gritty of things, but basically they dispersed the sit-in, killed 130 people, when we were having talks with them to hand power to the civilians. We couldn't, and that sort of prevented any direct talks to take place, because people were very radicalized. And that's when Africa, Ethiopia and the African Union and other forces kind of players stepped in to help mediate what's happening in Sudan. A couple of days ago, we achieved a power-sharing, call it a deal, whatever name you want to give to it. There's mixed feelings about this. There are people who are tired, who see this as a first step towards democracy, and who talk about thinking about clear plans in future to achieve more democracy and democratize the country in a much better way. And there are people like myself who are very skeptical about what's going on, and who think that what's going on now is actually a matter of buying time by the military. These guys are actually... They are supported by the UAE, and trust me, they have the best advisors in the world, and they know how to play politics. The guy called Hemeti was actually a Kamal trader. I don't believe he's got any political ideology. I don't think he can think on his feet. I think he's just literally supported financially and mentally by the UAE and the Saudis. I think people should get on with what's going on. However, we need to have clear plans about how to protect the Sudanese uprising, about how to protect the revolution. Neighborhood committees should carry on working as usual and make sure and make sure the media is actually neutral. It's not a media that is used actually to give the support and to glorify Hemeti and his lot. We need to make sure that talks and different seminars and sort of political awareness events are taking place everywhere. We need to make sure that people are actually involved in any kind of decision making that is related to their future and the future of their kids. This is the revolution of Sudan. Hope you got a bit inspired. One thing that I'm sure about is that this new generation, my generation, is a generation that brought lots of hope in Sudan. It is a generation that will defy any kind of dictatorship in future. It is a generation that knows that there's nothing to fear but fear itself. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Mohamed. That was a brilliant introduction. Our next speaker is Sara Abdeljalil, who's the president of the Sudanese Doctors Union UK branch, and she's going to speak to us for the next 10 minutes.
Thank you very much. I don't know how I can follow Mohamed. First of all, I'm not going to be able to stand. I would like to thank Anne Alexander for giving us this opportunity to come and talk about what's happening in Sudan. I would like to say that, or start my talk by saying you can never... Is it working now? You try it? Okay, so yeah, that seems to be. So I would like to start saying you can never plan a revolution. We have been waiting for years and years and feeling that what else could happen? We must change this regime. People have been killed in Darfur, Jibal al-Nuba, in the north, in the east, in the west. We lost the south, and every day we feel there's nothing else that we should be waiting for, and this regime should go. But actually, what we have learned from this revolution, that the right time will come, and how will that be achieved is when everybody will come together and be standing at the same platform, reading the same page. I would like to give you just a bit of a flavor about how we reached that point, and I will start from 2016. A lot of things happened before that, but I think from 2016 up to 2018 there have been some events, and these events actually have increased the awareness among the people of Sudan and gave them confidence that they can make change. Because we lost confidence, as Mohamed said, in 2013, 200 people were just killed in a few days, and that was a big shock for us, and I wouldn't think that anybody will be able to go out to the street easily. In 2016, there have been a lot of strikes. One of them was the doctor strike, and that has brought people to think about where are the unionists. Always in the history of Sudan, the unionists have played a major role in change toward democracy in the 60s and in the 80s. But in 1989, as soon as Omar al-Bashir took over, they demolished all the legitimate unions, and they were replaced by what is known as the pro-regime union, where you are not elected, you are the president because you are affiliated to the same group. And let us remember that this military coup has got an ideology. So a coup on itself is a disaster, but a coup with an ideology like the Islamic Front line, they wanted to implement their view as much as they can. And then they changed all of the public institutions and organization, and we had a lot of private sectors. So therefore, you lost your team and your colleagues to sit together, to negotiate, to talk, to debate, how can we make change? After that, there has been a mass immigration. When I think about myself, I never thought I'll stay in the UK for 18 years. I always thought I will come, I will do my training, I will go back. And there are thousands like me who have left Sudan because we could not work or survive there. We felt like we have been expelled out of our country. But above all of that, there was austerity measures that have been very, very violent. In 1990, I was still a secondary school student at that time. I remember that Dr. Ali Fadl, during the Sudan doctor strike, was killed in detention by a nail and a hammer, a severe head injury. So that means that we were all silenced, we were all frightened, and we are all human beings. And so the confidence was lost. So in 2016, part of this confidence came back because there was quite a few strikes among different professionals. And people think that, okay, we are there, I'm not alone, there are other people with me. Not everybody is part of this regime. By the end of 2016, we had the civil disobedience, and that was like a test. And people thought, will it be successful or will we fail? And then we had a run between 2017 until 2018 where we had an epidemic. It was like medical emergencies. But believe me, we had the cholera outbreak. In this cholera outbreak, actually we had 22 between NGOs, between professionals, between politicians, between activists coming together to try to work for this sort of outbreak, because the government did not care about people. So people in Sudan did not only die from bullets. People in Sudan died because they cannot access health services, and they can't access medication. And mothers have been, pregnant women have died because there is no antenatal care even. So that brought people together, and I think made a huge difference. Until the economical crisis was the tilt or the trigger in 2018. In January, there was the budget, which is called the hunger budget, where, if I give you an example, the expenditure on health was about less than 6%, while for army it was 60%. And the anger brought people outside to the streets, so it was led by the people. And we have to always say that. It is a revolution by the people of Sudan. And they are the ones who have started the revolution. It was not about fuel and bread. The media kept saying it was a protest for bread and for fuel. It was not, and nobody picked that. And everybody was like trying to be very cautious about naming it a revolution. What helped after that? What helped after that is there was an organization, unseen organization, invisible organization and unity that brought people together. And that's the professionals, the politicians, the civil societies, the community leaders, but mainly the youth. And Mohamed, he claims that's his generation, but I think it's his generation. And I think that we have two at the back as well. It's their generation. They are the ones who were born while Omar al-Bashir was there. They were born, they have never seen anything but Omar al-Bashir. For me, I was a teenager. I had like 4 years of democracy. I'm holding to that, to this memory. I was distributing leaflets when Fatma Ahmed Ibrahim was in an election. They didn't have that, but they did better than us. It just shows you that to lead a revolution, you don't have to be like, it can come even under austerity measures. So all of that came together. People have worked very hard to achieve change and democracy. But I don't think it's easy. We're still in a bumpy road. We still have got the deep state. We still have got the regime. We never thought about the TMC. The revolution as well teaches you that you can never plan and you can never predict. So we thought we are just fighting this regime. We're going to get off everybody, take over, and rebuild Sudan. And then all of a sudden, the Transitional Military Council came from nowhere. We didn't have that plan, so it took us some time. We went backwards, and now we're going forward. Where do we stand now? We haven't still achieved our goal. We still have to continue our fight. But we have to as well show that we are flexible, especially to the policymakers, because if we continue just to fight, they will label us as being not flexible. We don't want peace in Sudan. So we have to be calm, try to accept part of this negotiation and see whether it will work or not. But while we're watching, we have to continue our planning that we are back for the full fight if nothing is achieved. I don't think it will be achieved, but we have to wait and see. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Sarah. That was brilliant. Our last speaker before we come to questions and contributions is Anna Alexander, who's on the editorial board of the International Socialist Journal, and it is available with an up-to-date article on North Africa that will be on sale afterwards if you want. And she's also the co-editor of Middle East Solidarity, which again is an up-to-date account of what's going on and is a really, really good magazine. And that's available as well if people want that.
Thank you. Can everyone hear me? So firstly, I want to say it's a real privilege to be on the platform with Sara and Mohamed. And it is a fantastic opportunity to stand here and talk about the return of revolution. 8 years after the Arab Spring that erupted in 2011, we're talking about revolution shaking the region, but also proving actually that this isn't just a question about, there wasn't some Arabness about the revolutions that happened in the sense of it was something located in language or character or whatever. It was actually about very deeply ingrained processes in those states and societies where you have authoritarian regimes that have been pushing through neoliberal policies, have been acting in the interests of imperialist powers. And that kind of contradiction is something that has been exploded by mass movements from below. So what happens in Sudan is not just of relevance and has a resonance in the Middle East, in the Arab world, in Iran or in Turkey, but it also has a resonance across Africa, across large areas of the globe. And it has a resonance for us in Europe as well. And I'll say a bit more about that in a minute. Now, I want to speak largely in my contribution, or quite a lot in my contribution, about Algeria. And I should say, although I'm not Algerian, what I'm relaying here is based on having had deep conversations with Algerian comrades. I was hoping that we would be able to show a video message from comrades from the Parti Socialiste des Travailleurs, who's a revolutionary a socialist organisation in Algeria. We didn't manage to make it, partly because they are extremely busy in the throes of organising in a revolution, which I'll say more about later. But I would urge you to read the interviews that we've done with them in Middle East Solidarity to get also in their words what's happening. So how do we fit Algeria into this picture? Where does it fit into this, what we're seeing in terms of revolution? Well, there are a number of aspects where it's actually relatively similar to Sudan. The roots of the revolution are not just political; they are also economic. So, if you look in Algeria over the last few years, again, Algeria was one of the countries where there wasn't very much happened in 2011. There were some attempts to get protests going, but they were basically suffocated and crushed. One of the reasons for that was because of the terrible military coup followed by civil war in the 1990s. But another reason why revolution didn't occur in Algeria in 2011 was that actually the regime in Algeria was able to use the oil and gas money that it gains. A large proportion of the Algerian economy, the revenues of the state, a massive proportion are derived from the country's oil and gas resources. And that at that point it was still able to buy off people's anger, essentially. It's not to say that it was evenly distributed through society. There's still massive inequality. But over the years since 2011, there was a massive wave of cuts and austerity measures which reflected the weakening position of the Algerian economy. And that offensive in terms of the neoliberal agenda and the restructuring of the public sector was one of the sources of the social revolt that has been shaking Algeria for several years before 2019. Again, as in Sudan, there was a massive rhetoric about this as something that came out of nowhere. I have to say, actually, and we had an article in Middle East Solidarity in 2017 where the author Gianni Del Panta, who's Italian activist, wrote about the coming storm in Algeria. And he was absolutely right. He talked about, in that article, about how protests among public sector workers, like the doctors and teachers in Algeria, as in Sudan, junior doctors, teachers, public sector workers, building independent unions, outside of the existing union structures in some cases, and sometimes fighting within the trade unions in Algeria. In the case of Algeria, the main trade union federation is not was not quite as corrupt and taken over by the regime all the way through as in Sudan, but the leadership of it was totally in bed with the regime. And so there was fights both inside and outside of the main trade union structure. A very important place where other kinds of social struggles were taking place was also among people who were unemployed and marginalised. One of the drivers for the social revolt was actually a wave of protests against fracking. Although Algeria has massive resources of oil and gas, deep oil and gas reserves, they were also expanding into attempts to start fracking in the Saharan areas in the south of the country. And this would have been utterly catastrophic for people living in the region in terms of their water resources, in terms of the damage it was going to do to the economy. And there were massive protest movement, which was met with very fierce repression. And actually, it touched off a kind of resonance of solidarity inside Algeria about how some of the people who were the most poorest and most marginalised, yet were living in this area where resources are being sucked out from under them and benefiting people at the top of society. So there is a prehistory of social struggle and organisation that feeds into the revolt that erupted in January this year. And in January this year, the thing that triggered this revolt was the attempt by Abdelaziz Bouteflika, who was then president, a man who had not been seen in public for 8 years, to stand again for a fifth term as president. And this triggered off a wave of mass mobilisations, which started off with the simple demand of no fifth term for Bouteflika, and has now radicalised into something which is much more fundamentally connecting with the demand about changing the state. And I want to focus on this in the last few minutes that I've got in my contribution, because what we've seen in Algeria has been massive waves of strikes and protests. We've had every 20 Fridays in a row, people have come out onto the streets, mobilised in their hundreds of thousands and sometimes their millions to demand change. As I said back in January, the main slogans were around Bouteflika stepping down. Now, actually, the slogans are very much directed against the leadership of the army, against Khai Salah, who is the head of the army, who has put himself as the front person for the state, for the deep state, for the networks of power and privilege, which the Algerians like to call the gang, al-Isaba, that they are the bunch of corrupt businessmen, politicians, generals who were there at the heart of the state. And they have, as was the case in Sudan, used tactics of divide and rule to try and fragment the movement. So a few weeks ago, Khai Salah said that nobody should bring the Amazigh Berber flag onto demonstrations, that was not allowed on demonstrations. Protesters would have the flag confiscated from them, and the police have been incredibly repressive on Algerian demonstrations. Actually, the response to this was fantastic, because people went again with them in their hundreds of thousands, carrying the flag and demonstrating in defiance of the general's attempts to play tactics of divide and rule. But one of the things that the mass movement in Algeria has done is, I think, it's actually revealed something that isn't just about that specific group of generals and politicians, about their corruption, about their cronyism. All of those things are true. Nobody is denying their venality and their brutality. But I think it actually, as in the case of Sudan, reveals something much more fundamental about the nature of the state. That when we look to the work of revolutionaries in the past who analysed these issues, people like Vladimir Lenin, Russian revolutionary, that he identified in 1917 that the nature of the state, the concentrated power of the state, is in these special bodies of armed men, and the way they work with the civilian bureaucracy is that the state itself is not neutral. The state itself is an instrument in the hands of the ruling class. And that is what revolution reveals. Revolution reveals the class nature of the state. And actually it puts a question to the mass movement, is that will the people remake the state in its image, or will the state remake the people? Will the state be allowed to divide the movement in Algeria and set people against each other if they happen to speak Arabic versus if they happen to speak Tamazight, the Amazigh language? Will it set people against each other if they happen to come from Darfur and Sudan against other places in Sudan? Will it set men against women? That those kinds of divisions and use of oppression are something that the counter-revolution always does. And in the last few minutes, I also want to consider this question in relation to the state, not just the state as a singular object, but the state in its international context. Because again, in both the cases of Algeria and Sudan, it is not simply the fact that counter-revolution is being planned in the corridors of power in Algiers or in Khartoum. It is also being planned and supported in Riyadh in Saudi Arabia, and it's being planned and supported in Paris by the French state, and it's being planned and supported in London and in the capitals of Europe and in the US. Because all of the greater states in the world, particularly the major imperialist powers, have something at stake in crushing the revolutions in Sudan and Algeria. That is in their interest. The people who are in power in those states are not only acting in the interests of their own local ruling class, but they are acting in the interests of the imperialist powers who extract the resources of those countries. In the case of Algeria, you're talking about the oil and gas that goes directly to the European Union. You're also talking about the role that they play in policing migration. That one of the reasons why the EU is so desperately keen to make sure that things in Sudan go away that is in their interest is because the EU's border arrangements are externalised to Sudan. That Hemeti, that jumped-up bandit turned counter-revolutionary henchman, who was he trained by? Where did his forces get their money from? Yes, some of it came from Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, but actually they were empowered by the Khartoum process, which brought the borders of Europe into the desert between Libya and Sudan, and allowed people like him to become the second in command in the Sudanese state. So if we want to ask what we should do here in Europe, we have a very simple answer for the people in the European Union, for the British government, for the US government. In fact, the US Special Envoy who sat and had dinner with the man who was responsible for genocide in Darfur and responsible for the murder of 130 peaceful protesters. A few days later, the US envoy was sitting down and having dinner with him. We have a message for them that we stand with our brothers and sisters in Sudan and Algeria. We stand with them against their own state. We stand with them against our states. We will do everything in our power to organise in solidarity with them. Thank you.
The way that the regime tries to divide and rule in Algeria, I think some of the strategies started off with trying to contain the movement, secondly trying to buy people off, thirdly promising things like new constitutional arrangements, new elections, of course under the existing regime. They turned to anti-corruption measures, which is laughable, and people saw through it really because it's the corrupt investigating the corrupt, at the same time as they're imprisoning human rights activists, and even Lakhdar, sorry, I've got his name wrong here, but one of the leaders of the War of Independence, now in prison for speaking up against the regime. Then they increased it by roadblocks, and so on. And then, of course, out comes the divide and rule card with the Berber or the Amazigh issue. Now, they said that they were infiltrating the popular protest. How a people can infiltrate itself, I don't know. Calling them sons of France. Sorry?
Use the mic because you get struggling to hear.
I am using the mic. Is it not on?
But right into it.
When we first heard about the banning of the Berber flag, we were really, really nervous. And the reason we're nervous is because there was the Berber Spring back in 1980, which was severely repressed. The Black Spring in 2001, where millions of Kabils, the main Berber group there, marched on Algiers, 126 were killed. So when it came to will this divide and rule thing work, we were very nervous indeed, and it was brilliant to see everywhere across Algeria people flying both the national flag and the Amazigh flag. So this clearly isn't going to work either. So my guess is the repression is going to increase. Now the question is then, how does the mass movement respond? Because one key issue everywhere, whether it's Algeria, Sudan, Portugal, Chile, whatever, is first of all how to win, and secondly what follows. And I think what suffered in Algeria is political organisations that have been incorporated or bought off or repressed. And what is missing is political organisation coming from the base, workers' councils, universities, students' councils and so on. That level, at the moment people are saying it's brilliant, which it is brilliant, that we have these 20 demonstrations and they carry on. We don't need political leaders, we don't need spokesmen, we just have the mass movement. That isn't enough, as Anne was saying. If you're to defeat a state that is so entrenched, you need something building from the base and you need political organisation.
Thank you very much.
Comrade here with the grey shirt, followed by the comrade with the white.
My name is Mahir Diab, SPW Portsmouth. I'm from Sudan. I was quite lucky that I witnessed and participated in Egypt Revolution in 2011. And so I can tell the differences between the two revolutions. Particularly in Sudan, the most important thing in every revolution, I think, the succession is about the leadership, the strong, good leadership of the revolution, whether it is from top to bottom or the opposite. The leadership is very important. In Sudan, for example, SPA, Sudan Professional Association, first they started by hidden, as she said, and after that they come, and people they used to, and still listening to them very nicely in a very strange and different way. If they say, for example, there is a demonstration today Sunday at 3 o'clock in X Street, the first thing will happen before the time, the street will be full of the soldiers. And after that, people will come back. They don't show themselves. They just act as they are selling or buying or doing anything. 1 o'clock exactly is fascinating to know that the starting point normally is by women. One women start by ululation. Ululation, ululation. And after that, another one starts shouting by حرية سلام وعدالة والثورة خيار الشعب, which is freedom, peace and justice, and revolution is the choice of people. People, they come from nowhere, and within seconds you will find thousands of people, and the soldier disappear quickly, because without expectation, tens of thousands of people, you cannot imagine where they come from. And if the leadership, SPA, if they say there is another revolution at certain time in certain place, immediately people not before 1 minute, not after 1 minute, in the exact time, which was very good and is still going on in Sudan. The last thing I want to address, because he reminded me about the role of the state, international state, that the Janjaweed militia, who are killing people in Sudan, is funded by the EU. The EU is funding them just in the name of they don't want immigrants to cross the Mediterranean. Immigrants, they come from Somalia, from Eritrea, from Ethiopia, from everywhere across Sahara's desert. They funded them. That means every one of you is funded this killing by funding the EU. Thank you very much.
Followed by the one at the end of the row in the front row here.
I just want to make a link between the question of the revolutions in Sudan and Algeria with the question of climate change, which is another, Anne referred to the question of fracking and oil and so on. But it's very simple in a sense. If you live in an ocean, in an island in the ocean, in the Indian Ocean, what you're threatened by is rising sea levels. But if you live in Sudan, one of the hottest countries in the world, what is global warming going to mean in Sudan? It was already a factor in Darfur, in the terrible war, the problem of irrigation, lack of water. The temperature rises much more in Sudan, which is going to happen. Agriculture in Sudan is going to be seriously damaged, if not destroyed, and if it rises a great deal in, say, the next 5 to 10 years, which is very, very likely, large parts are going to become uninhabitable. Now, this is not just a natural process. This raises the question of what, in those circumstances, does Horea Salam Abadallah mean? It means to cope with that, you will have to have economic justice in the society, or the poor and the masses will starve. I think it makes the question of achieving a different form of society out of this even more urgent in a place like Sudan and Algeria, where a rise in the temperature is so threatening to the basic livelihood of the mass of people. You need democratic socialist planning to survive that kind of process.
I want to emphasise a few of the points about the Sudanese revolution that should make us lift up our heads. The first is that the sit-ins that the comrades described were not simply a passive process, they were an active reshaping of Sudanese society. People organising security, distribution of food, artistic endeavours, communications, a whole taking over of the way that society was run. Now, it wasn't a complete transformation, it was temporary, it was destroyed, but nonetheless it showed the capacity of people to organise themselves. The second thing is the role of women. Women have been right at the front of the Sudanese revolution, and it shows us that when this process begins, all of the oppressed and exploited begin to organise in new ways. It's fantastic that all the slogans you hear in London as well as in Khartoum are "We are all Darfur," no to war in Kordofan, no to war in Blue Nile. In other words, breaking against all the attempts to divide and rule. The fourth thing is the role of the mass mobilisation and the, crucially, strikes. I would argue that the moments at which the regime cracked in Sudan were those, yes, by the huge demonstrations on the streets, but the general strikes were what really broke them. In a negative way, you can say that the 3rd of June massacre was because they were so terrified by the situation created by the general strikes. And finally, I would say, this is easy for me to say, sitting in a secure room in London. I think the deal is a huge mistake in Sudan. And I think it will be used by the military to re-establish themselves. It will be used to break the momentum of resistance, and therefore I agree absolutely that we have to stress, keep going onto the streets, keep organising, keep the neighbourhood committees, keep the resistance committees going and so on. But I think also that we need to say, out of that fantastic mass mobilisation, which we have absolute solidarity with and which inspires us all, there has to be also the creation of alternative sections of power that can provide a way for ordinary people to take charge of society. Not just pressure on the top, but creating an alternative society, what they did in Russia around the workers' councils, but those sorts of things flowing out of the strike committees that were created. The revolution has been an inspiration to all of us. We offer it our solidarity. We need also to learn its political lessons. Thank you.
Thanks. So, I am inspired, and I had a couple of questions. Following on from what the last speaker said, I wondered, could the Sudanese speakers, Mohamed and Sara, could you elaborate on these neighbourhood committees? To what how do they organise? To what extent are they playing the role that the last speaker described? Because whenever we look at the great revolutions of the past, the bodies that people have created to organise themselves, the Soviets in Russia, the Cordones in Chile and things like that, have been crucial to deciding the direction of the revolution and the embryo of what could come out of it afterwards. I'd really love to know more about those things. Secondly, there have always been debates within those things about the direction of it, and people want some organising to try and get conciliation and compromise, others pushing to go further. There's obviously a very real left tradition in Sudan, and I'd like to know more about who is organising inside those to put arguments similar to the ones the last speaker made. To what extent is there a revolutionary left in whatever form inside these committees and inside the revolution putting those arguments? Thirdly, I wanted to ask, a lot of us, I think, have been to Calais to do solidarity with refugees there. One story that kept recurring when I spoke to people there was people who had first fled Darfur because of the massacres there, not to come to Europe, to go to Khartoum, and then continued to face terrible repression in Khartoum, and that's why they left. And to me, that makes me want to know more about the legacy of that conflict and the displacement that it caused. To what extent is that shaping the context of this revolution? And at that time, I also had a question for Anne, which is about the legacy in Algeria of the War of Independence against the French, because obviously the regime does try to use that now very tainted inheritance for its legitimacy, but they don't have a monopoly on that at all. And to what extent do the now probably quite distant memories of the struggle against colonialism, are they a reference point for people fighting today, and in what way?
Thank you very much. To be followed by the comrade.
Yes, we're firing a lot of questions at our speakers, and I'm going to add one, I'm afraid, to Mohamed and Sara. The achievements in Sudan have been immense, and the responsibilities on the leading activists are also immense. And one of the key things to do is to learn from the lessons of the past, and particularly the recent lessons. And I want to reference the Egyptian revolution here. That extraordinary movement brought down the regime of Hosni Mubarak. Hosni Mubarak and his family were jailed. They were all put on trial. Where are they now? At liberty. They're at liberty because there was a counter-revolution in Egypt. One of the first things that happened after al-Sisi came to power, after a military coup in 2013, was that billions of dollars flowed into Egypt to support the new regime from the Saudis and from the UAE. So in Egypt, the state and its backers in the region and elsewhere were engaged constantly in thinking about how can we drive back this movement? How can we make a counter-revolution? They succeeded after a couple of years in that counter-revolution. It wasn't a conspiracy. They strategized, and they drew on the lessons of the capitalist classes of the past. Now, I think it's very, very likely, and you've indicated this already, Mohamed, that there are forces in the region and more widely who are backing a counter-revolution, backing a survival strategy of the Sudanese state, and of particular importance to the Gulf regimes because they are having a lot of difficulties in that region. Instability in Yemen, something that I don't think we've talked about so far in this Marxism, is the extraordinary movements in Iraq, which followed the invasion and the disaster created in Iraq by the Americans. An extraordinary movement there, which is destabilising the region also. So these regimes and their backers around the world, and especially in the US, are very, very concerned to knock the Sudanese revolution on the head. Now, the state can't be seized and occupied by the movement. It can't be transformed. It can't be modified. Key lesson from Egypt and elsewhere is that the state has to be replaced by something different. We know the working class in the region has the power, and we've seen, and as Charlie's been testifying, organised labour has the strength to challenge and to transform. Does it have the strength? Are these debates taking place amongst your comrades about how to ensure that the counter-revolution will not succeed? Thank you.
Thank you.
Followed by the Kamal with rewriting.
Hi, my name is Hala. I'm Sudanese. So I just want to make a comment on the question on Sudan's history of social movements. Sudan does have a very deep history of opposition parties and social movements since the 70s. And actually the city where the protests erupted in December was Atbara, which is one of the biggest cities in Sudan, but it's also very known for its labor movements. And it's one of those cities that the current military, or even the previous military regime towards its end and the current one, tried to dismantle through military power and breaking those labor unions and forces. So we do have a history of mobilization and social activism, social democratic parties in the country from the past. And I feel like that's where all these ideologies that the youth have today have come from, really. And I also have a question for the panel. So seeing our current situation now, that the Force of Freedom and Change did sign an agreement with TMC, what does that mean for the mobilization of the youth? Because when we say we want a civilian state, it's not just having civilians sat at the top, at the chairs on top. It's really about having a proper civilian state and a rule of law state. So what can the youth or the people sitting in Sudan right now, very frustrated, I'm talking about myself, but I'm still very skeptical of this agreement. So what does that mean, and how can the youth mobilize to kind of build that from bottom up to be able to not allow the TMC or everyone who's trying to crush this revolution down? Thank you.
I was actually going to ask the girls if they could search their feelings, how are they living this revolution, because I know women's role is being very important on it. But also I wanted to ask if you are aware and if you know if Sudanese people are getting the international support, if they know we are in solidarity with them. And because I know it's being very difficult to get information in and out of the country. So yes, just that. Thank you very much.
So one of the things that I normally do with my coffee, cappuccino, is 3-in-1, and that works, and that's how I'm going to proceed with the questions. I think it works perfectly to do 3-in-1, because the questions are pretty kind of intermingled. Right, starting with the 3-in-1. The question about the youth, how are they going to mobilise? How are they going to make sure that what they've achieved so far cannot be hijacked by a certain strategy? Going back to your strategy. I like when you said they're strategizing. I think the youth need to counter-strategize. Just get a good understanding of what their strategies are and work against them. And I believe the way of doing that is actually by holding regular meetings. This is not the time to go to bed. This is not the time to rest. This is exactly what happened in 1985, all the way to 1989, when people trusted that democracy came, and it's all good, but we didn't understand that Al-Turabi, who was the biggest Islamist figure, was actually working behind the scene, strategizing for a future Islamist government. And that happened because people went to bed. This is not time to go to bed. This is time to stay awake, to hold regular meetings and talk politics. Someone, I think it was you, Charlie, you talked about alternative sections of power. this is exactly what should happen with the neighbourhood committees that worked on bringing down the current government. Themselves, they shouldn't go back to bed as well. It's not time to sleep. It is about time now. They organised and it is about time they knew that they had the power. They are the very ones that brought down such a violent and volatile government. They have the power. They've just identified a very important source of power, which is unity. It is just when people stay united that they can achieve whatever they want to do. And I believe that politics should, the general population should be politicised. There's lots of talk, even now, in the political arena in Sudan. Now, some leaders know a bit better than the ordinary people. That politics is kind of, is the nitty-gritty of politics is known just by those, sort of intellectual living in the Tower Bridge, and they can tell you about, how to fathom the sophisticated political sort of processes and that sort of crap. Sorry for the word. But I believe the general population needs to be politicised and needs to understand that politics, actually all politics is local. Politics is not out there. Politics happens here. Decisions about infrastructure, about what has to be built and what has to go and what has to be established. These are all decisions that can be made on a local level. Coming back to the question about left and right, I personally do believe, although I do have huge trust in my generation, that I believe that there's a huge amount of political sort of immaturity when it comes to the left and the right. I don't believe that the youth actually do belong to any of these sections, or if you ask them to kind of, make the real difference between left and right, capitalist and socialist, it'd be very hard for them. And that's a good start, because they're not biased. They're not biased towards any, section of the spectrum. And finally, about the question of climate change here, I think if we talk about climate change in Sudan right now, people will look at you as an alien, an absolute alien. I fully understand. I lived in this country for too long. I completely understand the importance of it. But people have been struggling just to, bring bread to the table. They've been used to hot weather, and it is just about time we have an administration, a technocratic administration that has the experience and the knowledge and the nationalism, in a good way, that can convey the knowledge and stress about the importance of such issues. Thank you. Just one last thing. Someone in this panel said revolution can come under austerity measures. I hope that tells you something about revolution.
Thank you very much. I'll ask Sara to speak next.
Yeah, I think I'll use it that way. I'm just going to put the answers in a quick talk. I think the revolution makes you learn that you have to divert. So you're walking on a road and there is a diversion, and then you have to find your way. And we have been going through this for a while. It's like as if we're sitting in an aeroplane and we are ready and we can see that's the airport, that's our destination, but we can't land because there is turbulence. And we are standing to wait to go through this turbulence, and then there is another turbulence. So the journey has been a very, very long journey for 30 years, and we're still not yet there. There are two factors that are very important that will affect the outcome. One of them is the social media and the internet, believe it or not. And at the moment, we have still internet blockage. Despite all of our campaign, despite the agreement, the internet is not back. It played a major role. So in Sudan, even if you're not going to buy bread, they go and buy the internet to make sure that they're connected and they know what's happening. So that's a major part, which has been blocked now. The second part is the presence of the rapid support forces in the middle of each city. They have not been only in Khartoum, they have been in another 10 cities. And they have the violence returned in Darfur. So how can we go out? How can I ask my cousin why you're not going to the the street, how you're not participating in the strike. I am here in Norwich. She can say to me when I open the door, Sara, they are just facing us. I don't know whether they will just assault me verbally or physically or sexually. So these two factors are very important to see where we can go first, like the street work that have been done every day. Climate change, I think, is an important part. And one of the campaigns that have been as well successful in bringing people together was in Al-Manasir in North Sudan, where they have displaced people to build the dams, and then they have put them in a place where you can't even live. And about 90 children died from scorpion stings because they don't have the antiviral, they can't access health services. For me as a pediatrician, I tried to work hard on that, but I couldn't do that because there was no system. We couldn't do anything. They were living in a place where scorpions at night just come out in waves, to the extent that kids, as soon as they can see it's like the sun is setting, they run into their beds and they sit. They don't want to go down because we will be stuck and we will be dead. It's a huge thing, and it has been sort of implemented in our environment, and we have lost a lot of resources. So it is a very, very valid point, in my opinion. The sit-in in Sudan has been our new Sudan, our hope, where we thought this is what we were dreaming for. And the way it was crushed is something we can never forgive. We cannot forgive how they crushed our people and killed the innocent people in Sudan. The general strike has been very successful, but there has been a lot of organization behind it. There has been a lot of campaigns trying to convince people to participate, and there's a lot of people who have lost their jobs. We don't know what will happen now. Will they be back to their work or not? So there is a price that they have paid. At the moment, we have a campaign that has been started by Sudanese diaspora in Australia called Keep Eyes on Sudan, because we still want you to be with us, and in solidarity, we don't want you to think things have been sorted and it's the end of the journey. رجال الأحياء ورجال المقاومة, the neighbor committees. As I said, since 2016 until now, the mobilization, the connection has been very strong. Now you know if Sara is useful, if Mohamed is useful, if Sara just talks, Sara can do this, Sara is good at that point. So people are well connected at the moment, and they are ready. And they have the leadership. It's just they have to feel safe so that they can go back and continue the fight. If anything we want to come out from here is like, we have to challenge the Khartoum process. We have to ask for a public inquiry. We have been discussing the Khartoum process every time, and we have been shown that there is no support for the rapid support forces. So the English, British, everybody in the UK have to challenge that, because as my colleague said, I'm paying taxes. I don't want my money to be paid to the RSF who are killing my people in Sudan, because this is not fair. I would like to end my talk and say to Hala, we will never let it end. We should not. You have to be monitoring, and this. If things are not going to the right way, you have to come back and say, move, we're going to take over.
Thank you very much indeed. Before I bring Anne back, can I say there will be posters at the end if you want to help raise money for the people who've been killed and injured in the resistance so far. There's the Middle East Solidarity magazine, and there's the article in the ISJ. So I'll ask Anne to complete the meeting. Do you want this one?
Thanks. Thank you very much. I want to come to the question that was asked about Algeria and the role that the War of Independence has been playing in the way in which the regime has been trying to justify itself, because it's quite an important question. So one of the things that the Algerian generals obviously trade on is the fact that in the case of Khai and others, they actually fought in the War of Independence against French colonialism. They were part of the Front de Libération Nationale, the National Liberation Front, which led the struggle against French colonialism. But what happened after they gained independence was that they gained control of the state, and following the arguments that I made earlier, that the state in a capitalist society is not the state of ordinary people, it's not a neutral body, it then served the interests of those people who became the new ruling class. They actually called themselves socialists. In Algeria. They had a kind of socialism which is not what I would call socialism, but it was quite similar to the sort of ideas that powered, for example, Kamal Abdel Nasser's regime in Egypt. Very similar sorts of conception of a sort of top-down state capitalist view of running society. And of course, what has happened since then is that those same people have been in power since the 1950s, since the 1960s, they are the ones who have also overseen the neoliberal reforms, and they are the ones who have, in many cases, their sons and daughters are now benefiting from privatisation, and they hide behind this fact. And in fact, it's not all of the veterans of the independence struggle are on the side of the generals. In fact, a very famous veteran of the independence struggle, Lakhdar Baraja, is in jail at the moment in Algeria. He was seized just a few weeks ago. He's a political prisoner, and there are other veterans from that struggle who've stood up and challenged the generals and are standing with the movement in the streets. This is why one of the slogans that keeps coming back on the protests, and was the theme of the protest last Friday, which marked the anniversary of the liberation of Algeria from colonial rule and independence, is to say that when fighting the French, we liberated the land, but we didn't liberate the people. Now we have to liberate the people, or rather the people have to liberate themselves. So the legacy of the struggles against colonialism lives on. In that, and the spirit of that struggle, I think, is being taken up more authentically by the people who are on the streets of Algiers facing Gaid Saleh than by the people that he represents inside the state. On the questions that Mohamed and Sara have already mentioned in terms of the how do we understand what's going on in Sudan at the moment, and what's the way forward, I totally agree with the point that Sara just ended with, that actually now is the point when people need to be organised, that younger activists need to be organising themselves independently of the people who are in negotiations, and they need to push forward with more waves of mass struggle, including particularly strikes. And this is where I want to come on to two questions that I want to take on. One is the issue around forms of popular organisation like the neighbourhood committees, and whether that in itself is likely to be enough. I think they're an enormous step forward. They are very, very important mechanisms for mobilisation. And as Sara mentioned, they do predate the uprising, but have become very much more widespread. However, if I understand rightly, they're largely geographically based. So they're based in a neighbourhood, and they mobilise people to come on the protests, to spread the news of the dates of the demonstrations, and organise to support the sit-ins when the sit-ins were taking place. However, I think there were other forms of organisation, revolutionary organisation, which actually, when you're talking about an offensive against the state, when you're talking about having the ability to match up and develop potentially into a kind of counterpart to the organised and concentrated military power of things like the Rapid Support Forces or the armed forces, that actually delegates of workers, delegates of people, delegations representing different workplaces and across different sectors have a different kind of power. It's not just the power of the masses in the street. It's the power that runs society itself. It's the power that shut Khartoum Airport the 28th, 29th of May and on the 9th to the 11th of June. We have a great poster for the general strike that the Sudanese Professionals Association put up for the 28th and 29th of May. The power that shuts down the port in Port Sudan. It's the power of organised workers. Previous times, they brought in a whole container, it's a container port. They didn't do just picket lines. They bring a container and put it with a crane and put it at the front of the port so no one can get in. It was all on Facebook. That kind of power, the power that shuts down as well the functioning of the ministries, the power that shuts down the financial services, the power that shuts down the things that bring the profits to the people at the top of society. That is where the real power to change things lies. And the forms of democratic organisation that are rooted in that power, I think, have a greater capacity to be a real counterweight to the state. And this is where we come on to the question about the technocratic government, because I do think there is experience of this in previous revolutions. Experience of sharing power with the generals. Actually, this is what the Muslim Brotherhood tried to do in Egypt in 2011, 2012. So we haven't really talked about the political complexion of the opposition and the regime in the different cases. But in the case of Sudan, the regime was in alliance with an Islamist party, so therefore the opposition tended to oppose that ideologically. In the case of Egypt and in the case of Algeria previously, in the round of mass protests that led up to the coup by the generals in the 1990s, actually the Islamists were in opposition. And in both cases, they thought that they could change the state from the top. In Egypt, the Muslim Brotherhood won the parliamentary elections and then won the presidential election. They tried to bring in new ministers at the top. They actually tried to stop people organising from the bottom to cleanse the institutions of the state. One of the things that happened in Egypt in 2011, even before the parliamentary elections, was committees were set up in ministries, in public sector workplaces. Tathir Mu'assasat ad-Dawla, cleanse the institutions of the state. That was one of the major slogans, and people started to try and do it from the bottom up. I think it is an illusion to believe that you can bring in some ministers at the top who will be able to change things while the state remains as it is, while it remains with this power of the armed bodies of men and the bureaucracy behind the scenes who control the state. And that's really where I want to finish, is with Lenin's point that actually if we want to see a real people's revolution in Algeria and Sudan, then the state machine cannot be taken from hand to hand. It must be smashed. It has to be smashed by ordinary people in Sudan, by the lowest social groups, by the people who are crushed by exploitation and oppression. That they are the people who will stamp on the course of this revolution their own demands, their attempts to build in a new way, a new society in the place of the old one that is being destroyed.
Thank you very much indeed.